I'm Jonathan Larson with TYT Investigates. This is TYTI Daily, and I'm joined today by Jorden Geiger, who's a member of Black Lives Matter in South Bend, born and raised in South Bend, and is joining us from South Bend now. How you doing, Jorden?
Hey, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot for joining me. So I do want to talk about the story that we were discussing, which I broke earlier this week, about what is on the secret police tapes that Pete Buttigieg has said are secret that he doesn't know about. I do want to talk to you about that a little bit later, but I want to start with you sort of walking me through what exactly is Black Lives Matter South Bend doing at this moment? What's the agenda? What are the priorities? Talk to me a little bit about that, if you could.
Yeah, so we've been working pretty closely with Eric Logan's family around getting justice for them in the aftermath of his death. We
He
have,
was killed earlier this. He was killed this summer by a white police officer during a confrontation, right? Where
yeah, June 16th, Father's Day, in fact.
yeah, yeah. And the
Yeah.
police say he was armed with a knife, but his body cam, the police officer's body camera was not on. So there are a lot of questions around this, and you guys have been organizing around this. So I just wanted to make sure people knew who Eric Logan was. So please continue.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, we've been organizing pretty closely with the family. We've had a number of demonstrations and protests. We've also put forward a set of demands that we've taken to Mayor Pete. Um, Most of those have not been met early on, in the early stages of this sort of saga. We were demanding that he submit a letter to the Department of Justice demanding or calling for an investigation into the South Bend Police Department, or just to look into the death of Eric Logan. We also asked that he send the county prosecutor, Ken Cotter, a letter encouraging him to request that a special prosecutor be assigned to the case, and that did happen. So Mayor Pete did send a letter. He didn't exactly call for or ask for the DOJ to investigate, but he did ask for them to see how they might be able to assist in some way. And then he also sent a letter to Ken Cotter. But beyond that, we did ask that he really look at his department policies within the police department. We also asked that he look to compensating the family financially, also in terms of mental health resources and with educational resources. We demanded that the chief of police, Scott Raskowski, be fired, and that he look to replacing members of the Board of Public Safety. As far as those latter demands, he has not really moved on those much at all. In response to our call for him to look at his department's policies and practices and have involve the community in that process, they did work with the Board of Public Safety, which oversees police promotions, hiring, firing, training. On a set of community advisory meetings that they've held within the community where community members can come and look at the police departmental policies with officers and Board of Public Safety members. He has not shown up to any of those meetings at all, which is very unfortunate.
He
Um,
who?
Mayor Pete, I'm sorry, Mayor Pete has not shown up to any of those meetings, which is very unfortunate. And over time, we've actually seen that community members, as we look at the attendance, we've seen that less and less community members have been attending these meetings, largely because they feel that it's sort of like surface level work. We're not really getting to anything like substantive as to how the community can really work with the city and the Department of or the South Bend Police Department to implement best practices.
So let's break down some of those things one by one. Um, the call or the demand for Chief Raskowski to resign or step down as chief of police. What's the reasoning there? Why do you want what's the rationale for saying he should step down, and what would be better as a result of that?
Oh, well, we just feel that just under his watch, there's been a lot of misconduct. So what we've seen just being in the community, canvassing, talking to people, is that we've actually found um, cases where police officers are still using excessive force against African Americans, against people with mental health issues. We've also seen Black men in particular being followed by police throughout the West Side community. And we know that he played a role in Sergeant O'Neill's promotion, and Sergeant O'Neill is the officer who murdered Eric Logan.
And there was some evidence of at least accusations of misconduct by Sergeant O'Neill, misconduct that had at least racial undertones to it. There were allegations about rhetoric.
Yeah.
We reported about allegations of O'Neill using excessive force against people of color. So these were, and so you're saying Ruskowski promoted him to sergeant without giving those things appropriate consideration or weight in the decision making. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And Sergeant O'Neill is known throughout the community as an officer who is aggressive and frankly racist.
Well, and I should point out that we did at the time of our reporting did reach out to the police department to try to get some comment or response from Sergeant O'Neill, of course, who I believe has since resigned. And in terms of the policies and I think you said best practices of the police department, what would those look like, and what do they look like now? What is the police department doing now? What are its procedures now that you think are inadequate, and what should they be?
So we've been looking at the policies. It's kind of hard to say. So, for example, we're trying to understand when an officer would use a taser versus a gun, for example. So there was a number of us who attended a recent uh, community advisory meeting where we had an officer who kind of oversees training within the department. And so we asked the officer exactly that, like, in what case or scenario would you use a taser versus a gun? And if that scenario involved a suspect having a knife, at what point would you opt to use a taser instead of shooting them? And the officer said that that anytime a suspect or a civilian is coming at them with a knife, then they have the liberty to use their to use a gun because they consider a knife to be a deadly weapon. So that we were a little taken aback by that because what we understand is that they have a 21-foot rule, and so long as a person is 21 feet away, then they're not necessarily considered an immediate threat, and therefore you don't have to use deadly force against them. So that was sort of concerning for us. So we see that over time, the South Bend Police Department has looked towards strengthening some of its policies, but we don't believe that officers are following those policies as they should. Um, so she just sort of, or this officer made this broad like claim, and we didn't quite understand where they were really coming from. Also, too, when you look at the body camera policy, we feel that there's just too much discretion at the hands of the officer. We feel that all officers should have to turn on their body cameras when they are interacting with civilians. In some of these scenarios that they've given us at some of these meetings, these community advisory meetings, they've been sort of they kind of center the experiences of officers, right? Like it's sort of like, if officer so and so is on lunch and Miss Molly comes and asks the officer if she can help him with retrieving her dog, and he's on lunch, should he turn on his body camera? I mean, it's just sort of like these ridiculous situations that aren't real, right? So we've been just looking at some of those kinds of things. Officer training. We found out that not all officers are actually receiving the same training. So you have veteran officers who are not taking some of the more current training. So the person who was sitting at our desk, or at our table, I'm sorry, they have been on the force for about 11 years. And they have this new training called Group Violence Intervention, where they do a presentation in front of officers and talk about, how to reduce group violence and how to identify different groups and such. And so we were asking the officer, well, can you explain, because the officer kept referring to these groups as gangs. And we said, well, what's the difference between a group and a gang? Because we feel that there is a group violence problem in South Bend where you have young teenagers, young kids who form these groups like Cash Out Boys or whatever. These aren't like conventional gangs that we think of, like Bloods, Crips, people who are engaged in a serious organized crime.
Organized crime. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, organized crime. And so the officer, again, who was a veteran on the force, said, "Oh, well, I haven't had that training. That's newer training, so I haven't had that." So then the training is not consistent and uniform and not being applied to all officers. And we actually had a board of public safety member sitting at our table when this officer said that. And that board of public safety member eventually got up and left the table. We don't know why, but they seemed to be a little concerned about what the officer was saying, so
And
much so
just
that they left the table.
and so people understand, in South Bend, the way it works is the mayor has some oversight of the police department, but so does the Common Council and so does the Board of Public Safety, which is appointed by the mayor. Do I have that right?
Right. So the Board of Public Safety is appointed by the mayor, yes. And the mayor also appoints the chief of police and the top level captains.
I see. Okay, thank you for filling that out. And so we've done some reporting. I first went to South Bend back in April, and we've done some reporting on various incidents where people have told us, or it's been reported, that they sought help from Mayor Buttigieg. There was a reverend, an activist, who witnessed an incident where the white police chief allegedly did not back up a black lieutenant. That reverend, the activist, said they went to Pete Buttigieg for help and got no response. We spoke with a mother whose son, Jihad Vasquez, was a 16-year-old boy, was found hanged. His death was declared a suicide with no investigation. She asked Pete Buttigieg for help. He said, call my office. The calls never went through and were never returned. And I've spoken to police officers as well who felt that they were the victims of discrimination or retribution, said that they emailed Mayor Buttigieg, sought help in other ways from him or from his office, got no response. It sounds like, and you were not a community activist at the time, we're talking about several years ago, earlier in Mayor Buttigieg's tenure as mayor, but it sounds like you've actually been able to have meetings with Mayor Buttigieg, Mayor Raskowski, and that in some way they have been responsive to you. It's not as though the entire Black community of South Bend is speaking with one voice that Buttigieg and Raskowski are bad and non-responsive, right? There are some people who say, yeah, they're stepping up, they're doing the right thing. So talk a little bit about the positive experiences, I guess I would put it, that you've had with Mayor Buttigieg and Chief Raskowski on these issues broadly.
That I personally have had?
Yeah, you and Black Lives Matter South Bend. That's right.
I can't say that we've had positive responses.
Oh, I see. Well, but I guess what I meant was at the very minimum, you're getting meetings, right?
Okay, right.
You've met with him, right? He's agreed to meet and talk with you.
So when I first returned to South Bend from graduate school in August of 2016, there was a verdict that was rendered by a federal grand jury. I can't remember through which court, but it was regarding the Desean Franklin case.
Right.
And that verdict was rendered.
Can you tell people real quickly what that one was?
Yeah, so there was an officer named Aaron Nepper, who's a really embattled officer. He's been involved in a number of cases of misconduct.
He was at the Eric Logan shooting and transported Logan to the hospital. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So he illegally entered the home of the Franklin family, tased and beat Desean up in his sleep, and accosted him and held him in his car, detained him for an hour or so. Federal grand
they ended up saying, "Oops, wrong person."
Yeah, exactly right. In a case of misidentification, exactly. So a federal grand jury determined that their civil rights were violated, and the family collectively was awarded a total of $18, right? So it was like $1 for each civil rights infraction, which totaled to $18 for the entire family. So when
Buttigieg responded, if I remember correctly, saying, I really wish they had taken the settlement we offered them.
Yes. And I've heard the settlement was a meager amount and they weren't happy with it. So yeah, that's that. But where I enter is I moved back to South Bend in August of 2016. this verdict came down, and then we were like, whoa, this is wrong, and we need this officer off of the force. Now, the city couldn't, or the Board of Public Safety couldn't retroactively go back and fire this officer, but we wanted to make the community aware that Aaron Knapp is a problem and that there are other officers in this force that are also a problem. So we started organizing around that case. It caught some national attention. It was front page of the Indy Star. I think it made the Washington Post. So it was picked up by a number of outlets outside of local media here. Sorry. And so during that time, the Buttigieg administration was sort of trying to control the narrative. So they would call in a group of, pastors who are not at all connected to the protests or the movement work being done around this case at all.
When you say pastors, are you referring to Black pastors?
I know that there were some non-Black pastors also present. So
Okay.
I would say members of clergy who were invited to this meeting.
Black and white.
Yeah, Black and white, exactly. Yeah. So one person I knew who white who actually attended the meeting said that he was not at all impressed with what was going on, and that he wanted to share with us what he shared with the mayor in that meeting, and share his thoughts and perspective on what he witnessed. So we move fast forward, I think, let's say September, the mayor holds a town hall meeting. It explodes. People are saying, play the tapes, play the tapes. They're not believing anything that Pete is saying around, pushing for justice and accountability, because for years people have been asking for this and they've yet to see that. Now, Daryl Boykins was present at that town hall. He's actually sat on the panel, as did Chief Scott Ruskowski and a number of other.
When Boykins was still on the force. He's the chief who had been demoted
Right.
Back in 2012, but he was still on the force as a captain. So you're saying he was on this panel at the town hall discussing the Desean Franklin case.
Exactly. Right. Well, really, it wasn't even about the Desean Franklin case. It was about police community relations broadly. Right.
Okay.
So towards the end, people start disrupting the meeting. People are saying, play the tapes. People are visibly upset. There's an article in the South Bend Tribune that covers, what went down in this meeting. And so I actually personally went to Chief Ruskowski afterwards and said, hey, it would be great if we could have a meeting with you, not as Black Lives Matter, we hadn't formed yet then, but just as a group, just a young group of, residents of South Bend who were concerned about police community relations, and we wanted to meet with the chief around doing some work to address some of these issues. He said, cool, great. Yeah, we can do that. Let's set that up. We set up the meeting. He never showed. From what I was told, he didn't show because Mayor Pete told him to stay away from it. And that was the only time I've really had.
You don't know that to be true. That's just something you heard. Just so we're clear, I want to be clear about the difference between what you know and experience directly and what we can't say whether it's actually true or not.
Exactly. Right. So he didn't say this to me directly. This is what I was told from, a trusted source.
Okay.
So he never showed up to the meeting, and we have not met with him since. I've not had a conversation with Ruskowski since. I only seen him at meetings, Board of Public Safety meetings, or at events if he's present. But I've never met with him.
I see.
Nor has Black Lives Matter. But we have met with Mayor Pete twice. You
have met with him twice. So talk about how those meetings came about and how they went.
Yeah. So the first meeting, we actually had, it was a phone call with Mayor Pete, and we had myself, Councilwoman Regina Williams-Preston, and two members of Black Lives Matter LA chapter. They were kind of like advising us, or just helping us sort of think about strategies as to how we can get some of our demands met, because they have a long history of doing this work, or a successful history of doing this work in LA. So we thought it would be good if they could join us on this conversation and kind of share some perspective with Mayor Pete as to what has been done in Los Angeles. Well, there were some things that Mayor Pete said that he was not really willing to move on, such as firing Chief Ruskowski. He feels that there's a number of people in the community, Black leaders, Black community members, who support the chief, and that if he were to fire or demote him, well, he said that he cannot fire him. Only the Board of Public Safety can fire him, but he can put him up for demotion.
Right.
So he felt that if he were to move on that in that way, with demoting Chief Ruskowski, that there will be members of the Black community who will be upset. He also said that there are members of the public who want more police. And
Sure.
at which point I asked him, I said, well, which public? Which public are you talking about? The white public or the Black public? Because I don't hear a lot of African Americans saying that they want more police. Now, there might be older African Americans saying that, but certainly not younger African Americans or middle-aged African Americans, folks who, I think that I represent, of my generation. He did say that he would be willing to help with mental health resources for the family. He said he couldn't move
Eric
on.
Logan's family.
Yeah, for Eric Logan's family. And then they talked about how they're looking to have this series of meetings, community advisory meetings on police policies and practices. So we thought, okay, like, we didn't get everything that we wanted, but it was good. It was only a 30-minute conversation. We were happy that he took the call, and we thought that we were moving in a forward direction. So then when we met with him a second time, this was in person, we asked him specifically about the implicit bias tests or initiatives that they've offered or administered on the police. So his diversity and inclusion officer said that they had put up these tests and things. They've created like this diversity awareness profile, and they've made the Harvard implicit bias test accessible to officers. And we wanted to know, like, if they had collected the data and if that data could be made publicly available. He said, okay, this seems like a reasonable request. Give me a week and I'll get back to you about that data. He also said that he would still continue to support helping to connect the family of Eric Logan with mental health resources. And so we had mentioned an event that Councilwoman Regina Williams Preston, some folks from the South Bend School Corporation who work around restorative justice, and a qualified IDI, which is the Intercultural Development Inventory Test. It's a cultural competency test, and person's an administrator who can administrate that test or administer that test. They were looking to hold these like healing circles in the West Side community for people who've been impacted by police violence and gun violence. Well, the first meeting was paid for by the South Bend School Corporation, and it was really great. We had a good turnout. People felt moved by it, and they were excited about the next meeting. Well, the city, we thought, would put up $2,500 to bring in this
The instructor.
expert. I'm sorry, what?
I was saying the instructor for this.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, the instructor, the expert. But we just recently found out that they were not willing to do that, and so now we're forced to like do crowdfunding. So we sort of feel, and Eric Logan's wife was actually involved. She really made this call for these circles.
Real quickly, where are you doing the crowdfunding in case people are interested?
Oh, we haven't started doing it yet.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
You'll have to let us know.
Yeah, definitely will. We definitely will.
You were
So-
talking about Eric Logan's family.
Yeah, so his wife had called for these healing circles. She was hoping that Dr. Raj, who's this expert, would come back and help facilitate, but the city said that they would not. So we're like, okay, well, you said, you'd support providing the family with mental health resources, and here you have family members not only wanting to create a space for themselves, but a space for more families that have been impacted by police brutality and gun violence in general. So that was a big letdown. But also, he said that he was not willing to work around demoting the chief or replacing Board of Public Safety members. He said that, we should come up with a list of folks and explain why they're qualified. And then, he might consider that proposal, or might leave it to the next mayor, whoever that might be. So yeah, we haven't really made much ground. We also found out right after that, not too long, like maybe 2 weeks after that meeting, that the data that they have on officers as it relates to implicit bias is not real data. It's sort of like performance, or it's like internal officer evaluations. So the officer essentially scores their level of cultural competency, I guess. There's like 7 competencies that relate to diversity and inclusion. So they have to give themselves a score and then their supervisor gives them the score. So it's sort of like this internal process of scoring, and we feel that it should be an external process. So, we're trying to work with them around. Well, we have been trying to kind of tease that out and work with them around that, but we don't feel that there's really been any forward movement. So that's why we call for Mayor Pete's resignation. The community advisory meetings, while well attended at first, the attendance is sort of like dwindled off now.
And you
Uh,
attribute that to the audience not having faith in
in the
progress.
process.
Mhm.
Yeah, people just don't have faith in the process. Again, it centers police. It just does not seem to be a process that really invites the community into learning about what the policies are and being able to shape them.
I noticed one thing you did not mention, which has probably gotten more emphasis in the mainstream media to whatever extent there's been coverage of this, which is the diversity on the force. If I remember correctly, the percentage of Black people on the South Bend Police Department, not talking about the civilian employees, but talking about uniformed officers, is roughly 6%, which is down from what it has been.
Yeah, less than 6%.
Less than 6%, excuse me. Um, is diversity on the force an issue for Black Lives Matter South Bend? And if so, why? And by why, what I mean is there's obviously, you want to be sure that any workplace is racially diverse. You want to make sure that your hiring process is an equitable process. But in terms of the outward effect or impact on the community, if the percentage of Black officers on the South Bend Police Department goes from 6 to 12, which Mayor Roger Parent from the 80s told me they were around 13 or 14, if that doubles roughly, say, how does that benefit the community? I realize I just asked you 6 questions, so take them in whatever order you want.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, honestly, because Black Lives Matter is not really bent on supporting the police. We see the police as an institution that has historically has oppressed Black people. But we do understand that for many people in the Black community, that having a police department or a police force that looks like them is important, and specifically a police force that looks like them and that also has members who reside in their communities, right? So we have discussed that a little bit with the mayor. So in our conversation, we talked about how, well, we asked, like, why is it that the police force is less than 6% Black, but 19% of the applicants are Black? What are some of those barriers that are preventing them from getting on the force? And he didn't really exactly know. He said, well, it could be with people are not passing the written exam, the physical exam, and the background check, the drug test, et cetera. But we've had conversation about it, but I can't say that that's really a high priority for us. And here's why. What is the point of encouraging more African Americans, and specifically more younger African Americans, to get onto the police force or to apply, if we know that the culture of the police force is one in which that is hostile towards Black people? If you have African American officers leaving the force and complaining about the fact that there was no real internal review process that would support officers who made allegations against other officers being racist, allegedly.
And I've spoken with officers who did leave the force for precisely that, with precisely that dynamic applying to their situation. So that's not a hypothetical that you're talking about. That's a very real thing where
right.
just in the few people I've been able to talk to, I've come across at least 2 examples I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, exactly, right. And they also feel that city leaders across the board, regardless of race, who they've turned to in the past, have not been supportive. So for us, it's like, well, why would we want to encourage more Black and brown people to join a department that is clearly toxic and hostile? It just doesn't really make sense.
So clean up this environment before we start throwing people into it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
That's an interesting perspective that I haven't really heard in any of the coverage about the diversity. And I should note there's also, I believe they've had a study in the works for a while. They went to an outside consultant for to help them, I think, with diversity and inclusion, I think in both hiring and city contracting.
Hmm.
And the study, if I recall correctly, was due in the spring of 2019 and still has not come out.
No, the study was initially due in the early part of this year, January, February, and then
Well, that's
apparently
the
the
most recent estimate, Jordan.
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm sorry.
I
Well,
didn't realize.
it's a
I didn't
frustrating
realize. Yeah,
situation because
yeah.
this is one where like I've been really involved in pushing the city around getting data on on what's happening with African Americans in South Bend. And so this is a really important study. When we first started having these conversations about diversity and inclusion and how we need to collect data looking at disparities as it relates to income and wealth, there was some discussion 3 years ago about having this disparity study, but there was concerns from members of the administration that it would be too expensive. Well, they eventually came around and paid for it because there was some push from Black city council members, and it was supposed to come out in the early part of this year. And then apparently the person who is leading the work or the organization got married, and so they couldn't release the study. And then now there's some other reason why they can't release it, and we don't know when it's going to be released now, right? We have no idea. But yeah, it's an important topic as we think about diversity and inclusion in the city of South Bend that just really is going unaddressed.
I ended up focusing a lot on police issues, obviously, if you've seen any of our reporting for at the Young Turks. But I did have a number of conversations when I first started out around sort of economic issues, and a lot of that related to racial disparity. And I had more than one interesting conversation with people who longtime South Bend folks, family were from South Bend,
Right.
the multiple generations, who talked about how um, working as city contractors or subcontractors used to be sort of a reliable ladder to the economic middle class for Black families in
Yeah.
South Bend, not just owning them, well, of course, but working for them and being able to work on projects that the city had contracted with minority-owned businesses, which of
Yeah.
course it's a pretty fairly well established mechanism, right? To ensure that you've got a minimum percentage that goes to it's typically minority or women owned businesses. And what was described to me was essentially that that's virtually disappeared, and that you just don't have a significant number, or at least not a relatively significant number, of Black-owned businesses where providing that sort of ladder out of, if not poverty, at least into the middle class.
Yeah, the procurement rate for African Americans over the course of Mayor Pete's tenure has been around 1%, and I think it's just under 2% currently. So it's been a long-standing issue. And what people are saying is that you have 1.3 or $5 billion um, in contracting work that goes out throughout the county of South Bend, mainly coming from the 10 largest employers. But yeah, we don't see any participation among African Americans in them getting those contracts. So it's a long-standing, it's been a big issue for a long time.
So let's talk a little bit. This predates your activism
Hmm.
as a South Bend native, but let's talk a little bit about. You mentioned Daryl Boykins. I talked about the reporting that we just did this week. Just to sum it up, the short version, to the extent I'm capable of it, is that we got access to documents showing that the city has known what is on these secret police tapes dating back to 2011. And the police tapes, according to these documents, chronicle months of discussion of white police officers regarding how to get Buttigieg's donors to get Buttigieg, who was then a candidate for mayor, to get rid of Daryl Boykins, who was the first Black police chief and had been in office for something like 4 years at that point. And some of the remarks included referring to Chief Boykins using Ebonics when they talked about him, alleging, seriously or in jest, it's not clear, that Boykins was covering up in some way or in some way assisting members of the group that you talked about earlier, the Cash Out Boys, predominantly, maybe exclusively, I don't know, Black group. And at one point, one of the officers is quoted as saying, it's going to be a fun time when all white people are in charge. So we revealed that this week. And the other aspect of this that we revealed is that although Mayor Buttigieg has said for years that he does not know what's on the tapes, has no knowledge of what's on the tapes, and is not even sure he can legally ask, but it turned out that in 2013, because he was sued over the firing of the woman who made these tapes and listened to the recordings, he fired her and she sued for wrongful termination. And then Buttigieg's lawyers asked her in these legal documents, what did you hear on the recordings and why did you transfer it to tapes? In other words, tell us what's on the tapes. And Buttigieg's own lawyers have had these documents for years while he's been publicly claiming, I don't know what's on them or if I can ask. So those are the sort of two pillars, I guess, of the report we put out this week. And I should note that the Buttigieg campaign really didn't offer a response to us. We didn't get much of a response, if any, from, we emailed police, we emailed the prosecutor's office looking for a comment from individuals, from the offices. The only two people involved in this, or alleged to be involved, were the two donors who both denied these conversations taking place to me. So what is actual fact here? We don't know. But we also know there are a lot of questions about who was Pete Buttigieg, candidate Pete Buttigieg, talking to in 2011 about the police force, about whether he should keep Boykins or to replace him, and with whom, and what the problems were with the police force. So all that said, it's a long and twisty article, so I don't expect you to have memorized all of it, but having read it, having talked about it with me a little bit, I'm just wondering what your thoughts on it are. What do you make of it in light of your experience with the city, with Buttigieg, with the SBPD?
Frankly, I'm not surprised. Even in my own family, Black men have talked about their own experiences with the police growing up from their early teenage years. And since returning to South Bend 3 years ago, I've heard a lot about these police tapes and about police misconduct. So just reading that only sort of reaffirmed for me that we do really have serious problems within the police department. I think it was an excellent report. I'm not sure if everyone can really grasp exactly like the just the seriousness of it. I've seen a lot of pushback from Pete supporters, from some people in the community, because it's just it's so jarring. But then also, I've seen from a lot of Black men who are saying, "Oh yeah, like this needs to come out. Like this is exactly what has happened." People love Daryl Boykins. You have to understand that people really did love and trust Daryl Boykins. Daryl
Buttigieg in
Boykins,
his book refers to him as popular.
yeah, he was very popular. So, I mean, I hear stories from men who talked about how Daryl Boykins was able to go into the community and talk to young men. He was seen as more of a mentor figure. He wasn't overly punitive. He wasn't heavy-handed, but he would really try to talk to young men and calm a situation or steer them in the right path. So that's why he had a lot of respect. He also started a program here from young people that's very popular and very well attended. So he has a lot of respect in the community. He's very well known. So yeah, people are hurt. People are hurt by the fact that Mayor Pete demoted him, and that Boykins ultimately left the force and sued the city as well. So just seeing this report,
the city settled with Chief Boykins, or then Captain Boykins.
Right, yeah, they settled with him, exactly. So all of this resurfacing right now, it's opening up old wounds, right? Where people are now seeing that the country is paying attention to these allegations that they've been making for years, these concerns that they've been making for decades now. So for me, it just only confirmed what I've heard from other people and what I believe to be true, that there's racism within the department, and that Mayor Pete was complicit in um, working to ouster Chief Boykins and to uplift white officers and yeah, into the highest ranks. So
Well, I
that
should
doesn't
I should
surprise me.
note it's unclear what knowledge Buttigieg had at the time of what these officers' intentions were. At one point in the entries, the officers say they believe Buttigieg to be unaware. But it does also suggest that Buttigieg was having extensive conversations back in spring and summer of 2011, before he was in office, with people around the issue of who should replace Darrell Boykins. Lynn Coleman, who was the special assistant to the mayor at the time, was the city's highest ranking Black official, had been a high ranking officer in the police department. Lynn Coleman doesn't seem to have been part of those discussions. So whether Buttigieg knew about the racial aspect of the animosity towards Boykins or not, it's not clear. It's still an open question, I would say, as to who was Buttigieg having these conversations with, and who is he not having those conversations with?
Yeah, he probably wasn't having conversations with black leaders because he would have known that that was a bad move. And he even acknowledged in his book that when he made that decision, that that really created a strain between him and the black community. So I'm not sure why he wasn't aware of what impact that would have prior to him making that decision. But I believe it to be because he was not talking with black leaders in the way that he should have been. And I've even heard from some people that when he came in, he made sort of like sweeping changes where he was getting rid of high level officials, high ranking officials within city government. I don't want to say any names. Uh,
Well,
well, you
Chief
said a
Boykins
name.
did in his lawsuit. Chief Boykins in his lawsuit and said specifically, he talked about Howard Buchanan, who had been the fire
Hmm.
chief, and he
Right.
talked about Lynn Coleman, the
Exactly
special
right.
assistant to the mayor we were just discussing. So yeah, it's those names are out there for sure. It's all
Yeah.
public record.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly. And those are the two names that I was referring to without actually saying their names. But
Yeah.
yeah, I've heard I've heard a lot about how they were sort of pushed out of the mayor's office, of the administration, and that it didn't really sit well with a lot of African Americans in the community, and so he had to really try to build trust. But I mean, to me, the clearest example right now is when you look at there was a recent survey conducted by a New York-based firm that found that there's low levels of confidence and trust in the police department, and it's especially low among African Americans. Here in South Bend, you have a police chief who's saying that only a handful of people are actually concerned about the officers' behaviors and their professionalism. Most people believe that police officers are very professional. Then you have another guy, Troy Warner, who won the Democratic Party nomination for the Ford City Council District. I think he also has been legal representation for the FOP and the South Bend Police Department, who wrote an op-ed piece saying that,
FOP is the fraternity of Fraternal Order of Police,
right,
essentially the police union.
yes, the police union,
Yeah,
exactly. Who
yeah.
wrote an op-ed piece responding to the brother of Eric Logan, who wrote about the first community advisory meeting. He wrote about how he thought it was distasteful that officers would come to that meeting with unconcealed weapons. Because when the chief came, he did not have his weapon out. I don't believe he even had a weapon on him, but other officers did. And so he talked about, when you have like communities that have been impacted by this kind of violence, what message does that send when your officers are coming in armed, like with unconcealed weapons? Well, Troy Warner went and wrote this piece saying activists aren't listening. If they were listening, they would know that, the policy states this and that officers had to be able to respond in case an emergency happens, XYZ. So it's just all of these efforts to sort of discredit us and to make us look like we're just a small group of rabble rousers who are on social media making these broad, unfounded claims about the police. And that's just not true. So we went to the last Board of Public Safety, not today's Board of Public Safety, but one last month. And they're held every third Wednesday of the month. And we had a petition signed by like 300 folks saying that we need to hold police officers accountable and that Chief Ruskowski needs to accept responsibility for the death of Eric Logan and step down. That it's only right. We've also gone beyond just listening, even though they keep saying that we're not listening, we're not listening. We've gone beyond listening. We've been facilitating conversations. We've gone to every single community advisory meeting. We actually have a member who is facilitating one of the small groups, and there's only typically like 5 or 6 groups. So he's facilitating one of these groups. And I myself, there's been a number of town hall meetings on the city budget, and I've been facilitating the conversation on public safety. So for them to make these broad claims like, oh, we're not listening to officers, we're not listening to what representatives from the police department are saying, it's totally untrue. We're not making these broad claims based on nothing. Like, we're listening to people in our community, and we're being engaged in the process, and we're seeing where the holes are, where the gaps are. So
before we go, I just want to sort of throw open the door and ask if there's anything else you think people should be aware of, or that you wanted to get out there before we go.
Yeah, I think we have to understand that this situation is bigger than Pete Buttigieg. I don't think Pete has been great on Black issues at all. I don't take him seriously as it relates to his Douglas plan. I mean, if you haven't had a plan for South Bend's Black community, how can you have a plan for the nation, African Americans across the nation? I just don't see how that can happen. Right now, we are engaged in the budget setting process right now. So far, we've not seen the police department budget reflecting any of the concerns that have been expressed over the last 2 months, all summer long. We don't see any more a real commitment to diversity and inclusion, implicit bias training, recruitment of officers. It's just more of the same. It's the same budget from previous years. Nothing is different. When you look at the budget for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we find that now the mayor is essentially putting 2 departments together and having one African American woman oversee both of those departments. So originally she was the diversity and inclusion officer over her office, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, but now she's over her office and the Human Rights Commission, which is an agency within city government where people can go and report
employment discrimination.
Yeah, employment discrimination, exactly. Yeah. So, and as it relates to the issue of minority contracts or minority contracting or procurement rates, they've only set money aside in the budget, or allocated money in the budget, the proposed budget, to fund 1 additional full-time employee that is already an office of 3 currently, which includes the diversity and inclusion officer and then 2 folks who help her. So they want to add 1 full-time position in that office that will work around increasing procurement rates among minorities. And their target goal is to increase it to 3 or 4%. And we're saying that that's just not enough, So we're not seeing anything substantive so far in his budget. But today there's a budget meeting on community investment, and then he's going to present his mayor's budget. So we're hoping that something good comes out of those 2 budgets today and next week. But right now it's awful.
And where can people find you, Jorden, and Black Lives Matter South Bend online, social media? Where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find us on Facebook at Black Lives Matter South Bend. So that's where we do most of our social media outreach.
Okay, Jorden Geiger, Black Lives Matter South Bend, thanks so much for joining me today on TYTI Daily. And if folks have enjoyed this interview, find it worthwhile, I hope you'll share it. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. There's one more thing. I'm so sorry. We also have a website too called blacklivessouthbend.com that people can go to. And there they can really see some of them, learn more about the systemic issues that are affecting African Americans in South Bend. I apologize for that.
That's quite all right. I'm just doing some advertising here. So folks should subscribe to us here on YouTube. Subscribe to TYT Investigate so you catch us every day at 11:30 here at TYTI Daily. And that'll do it for us today. Thank you again, Jorden Geiger. Thanks, everyone. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Bye now.